So, good morning everyone, and welcome to the Mile-End Institute post-EU referendum briefing. You can probably guess I am not Matthew d'Ancona. My name is Catherine Miller. I'm Executive Manager of the Mile-End Institute. Matthew is on his way, but until he gets here, I'm going to hold the fort because we're keen that we get everything up and running. We've obviously got a huge amount to talk through on this absolutely historic day, so I didn't want to keep anyone waiting. We are live streaming this, and so if you're asking questions at the end, which there will be time for, be aware that those are going live on the internet. We're also obviously live tweeting this. Our hashtag is MEI Europe, so please include that if you're tweeting about the event. We've got a great panel of speakers, which I think is testament to the quality of expertise we have at Queen Mary University. We're really pleased to have them all here. We're going to try and keep it very brief, rattle through as much as possible and leave time for questions. So I'm going to start off with Phil Cowley, who is hot from the Radio 4 studio and is still managing to keep a few thoughts coherent in his head, I think. So Phil, if you could start us off.
Well, I hope they'll be coherent. Although the amount of coffee I've had to keep me going, they might be less coherent than I would like. I'll start maybe by saying that of all the Radio 4 election programmes I've done, this was by far the one that made me, and I think several of the other people involved, more nervous than any other. There was the sort of realisation before we went on air that there was something terribly important about what we were going to do in a way that sometimes isn't true of local election night, for example. But fairly early on, actually in the evening, it became clear to me what was happening once Gibraltar was out of the way and Newcastle declared. It was obvious to me that something rather significant was underway. The turnout, as most of you know, was 72%, so that makes it the highest turnout for a UK-wide referendum in British history, higher than 75 and higher than 2011. It wasn't perhaps as high as some of the talk on the day indicated it was going to be, but it was high enough, higher than most recent general elections, and high enough to give a mandate to the decision, I think. One of the questions that I was asked by a foreign journalist soon after was there any danger or likelihood that this wouldn't be implemented? And I think given the scale of the vote, there is no danger of that at all. Those of you that were watching the elections will be aware there was a really obvious geographic pattern, which we expected, but I think it was probably starker than we expected. In Scotland, 62% of the Scottish voters voted to Remain, and Remain had a majority in every single one of the Scottish polling areas. In London, 60% of voters voted to Remain, part of the EU, and there was a Remain majority in all but 5 of the 33 polling areas. And even in Northern Ireland, where the difference was less stark, 56% voted to stay in the EU, and there was a majority for Remain in 11 of the 18 polling areas. Elsewhere, Leave dominated throughout all of the rest of England and Wales, and anyone surprised by the result in Wales hasn't been paying much attention to Welsh electoral politics recently. Leave was victorious, rising to 59% of the vote in both the East and West Midlands. In the East Midlands, Leave won in 38 of the 40 polling areas, and in the West Midlands they won in 29 of the 30 polling areas. So these were pretty comprehensive victories outside of London and outside of Scotland. And that difference we expected, but I think it was starker than we expected. To give you an example of this, once you exclude Gibraltar, here are the polling districts in which Remain did best. Lambeth, Hackney, Haringey, City of London, Islington, Wandsworth and Camden. And you will notice the similarity there. And here are the ones where Remain did least well. Boston, South Holland, Castle Point, Thurrock and Great Yarmouth. And again, any of you with any knowledge of British electoral geography will understand what links those areas. There was also, however, some really clear variation depending on the type of people that were in areas. So Remain did, or rather Leave did best in areas where there were relatively few graduates, relatively few young people, relatively small populations born outside of the UK. If you look just on the basis of opinion polls, for example, you find no difference between men and women in how they voted, but a really obvious age gradient. 18 to 24-year-olds, 38% voted to Remain, to Leave, rising to 60% of 65-year-olds. The one thing which I think is not as well noticed was that there was also a really stark difference north and south. In the southeast and southwest outside of London, Remain did pretty much as expected. What killed them was how they performed north of the M4 corridor, in the Midlands, the northwest and the north. And that was because in those areas, Labour voters did not turn out in the proportions that you might have expected.
Phil, thank you very much. Okay, now over to Tim Bale, who's got the most remarkable spider web in front of me, so I think that's going to be cleared into a few points.
She's talking about my notes here. Oh, well, welcome to Matt. Matt, come and
take over.
Come and take over from Catherine. Thank you, Catherine, by the way, for sitting in there. Matthew was understandably delayed because of the resignation of the Prime Minister, and his newspaper, The Guardian, fair enough really, wanted his instant reaction. So I expect, can you read that online already?
I think it should be up now or very shortly.
Okay,
so my apologies for being late.
Okay.
But as Tim says, it was one of those things that you're just about to, you know how it is, you're about to leave the house, and you suddenly hear that the Prime Minister has resigned.
Yeah,
it's
happens all the time.
I think
it?
it's going to be one of those days. Yeah. Anyway, don't let me delay the really important stuff any further.
So
we've got an order first.
It's me now.
Okay, off to Tim.
Okay, right. Well, first thing we know is David Cameron has resigned. So what does that mean for the Conservative Party? That means a leadership contest. Interesting in the Conservative Party, if it follows David Cameron's wishes, is going to have that done and dusted by the time it has its annual conference at the beginning of October. So we are not going to get the situation we had back in 2005, where that conference was the occasion for the candidates to set out their stall, both to the country and to the membership. It's going to be a concertinaed affair in which Boris Johnson must be the standout favourite. There will clearly be a number of MPs who would like to find a stop Boris candidate, and they will presumably have to choose then between Theresa May and one of the rather newer entrants into the cabinet, someone like Stephen Crabb, for example, or any number of Brexiteers who might fancy their chances. I suspect, however, that Johnson will go through to the last two, whatever their efforts, and I think he will then be extremely difficult to stop. Interesting, he's a charismatic politician, obviously a fantastic campaigner, but we are talking about making Tory leader and British Prime Minister a man who has never held high ministerial office. That doesn't necessarily mean he'll make a bad job of it. After all, David Cameron had not held high office himself when he took over in 2005 and then became Prime Minister in 2010, and whatever the disaster that has befallen him over the last day or so, one could say that for the most part he made a reasonable fist of the job. I think if Boris Johnson becomes Tory leader and becomes Prime Minister, the temptation for him to call an early election will be absolutely overwhelming. I would guess that we will be into a general election in May 2017. I would also guess that given the momentum that Boris Johnson will have behind him, and given how weak the Labour Party is, that the Conservative Party stands a very good chance of getting a reasonably impressive overall majority at that election. One reason Boris will want to do that is because he doesn't want to make the Gordon Brown mistake. He would like a personal mandate. It's also, I think, very important, given how difficult the next 2 or 3 years are going to be, that the Conservatives have a bigger overall majority so they can actually get some of the legislation through. And it will also be far too tempting, I think, to take on a Labour Party that is obviously very, very weak before possibly the electorate wake up to the fact that the Leave campaigners cannot possibly keep all of the promises that they made to voters during this referendum. What does that mean for the Labour Party? Very quickly, the Labour Party, if there is an early election, will lose that election very, very badly. This is undeniably good news for the Labour Party because it means that they will short-circuit their leadership problem. The alternative to that would have been limping on until 2020 and then losing. This way, they get to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn 3 years earlier than was otherwise the case, and therefore can get themselves a leader who stands more of a chance of helping Labour to rebuild and stand some chance anyway of countering the Tories. Just to finish up, I'm not going to talk about the Liberal Democrats. Why bother? I am going to say something about UKIP, however. It will be very interesting to see if UKIP can survive this. One school of thought would say actually the issue space for UKIP has now been closed down. They've got what they wanted. They will probably find themselves confronting a Conservative Party that is now more than ever absolutely determined to do something about their other signature issue, immigration. There may simply be no space for a radical right-wing populist party if the Conservative Party moves into that position. It may not be the case, but I think we have to think whether UKIP's long-term future actually exists now. So that's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Tim. That's absolutely fascinating. Can we move seamlessly then to Mike?
Thank you very much. I'm going to press a button, which I hope is going to produce a couple of maps. The first part of this, I'm just going to really underline and maybe illustrate a couple of things that Phil has already said. Then I want to talk a little bit about what are the territorial issues and national issues that are within the UK that may well now become pressing as a result of this result. But just to start with some of the data, I mean, the map here, this is the result aggregated into regions, and it produces, of course, a rather dramatic type of map, which is, of course, quite slightly exaggerated, of course, because within, say, the northwest, you've got both urban and rural areas, but it does illustrate quite dramatically that a very profound bifurcation has happened here within England, and very broadly put, you have a pattern whereby in most of the regions outside London, the northwest actually is a slight outlier to this, but in most of the regions you have something that looks almost like a 60-40 split, not quite that, but getting up to that in favour of Leave. And then in London you have the opposite, you have the reverse, and that clearly represents a very major fault line, I think, within English political culture. Now, there are two stories here that I think are worth pointing out, and the map becomes a little bit more nuanced if we just colour it in by authority area. One is that certain areas, exactly as Phil mentioned, Boston, Lincoln, coastal towns, have performed the role as kind of super skeptic in terms of their response to the EU, and that I think was broadly anticipated. There's been quite a lot of talk in the academic literature, and it's spilled a bit into politics about areas that are supposedly left behind, that those that are not in economic terms connected to the circuits of growth, of opportunity, of jobs, and where there may also be a less cosmopolitan, less liberal attitude that tends to prevail, particularly amongst older populations. And that clearly has been one factor at work here. But you've got something else actually in England that is related but really quite different, or has happened to a degree that people I don't think generally anticipated, though some Labour MPs were beginning to press the panic button about this. And that is the scepticism, or the anti-EU vote, that has been registered in large former industrial cities in parts of the Labour heartland. And there you have some really quite striking results, and actually an interesting divide between those cities, Manchester and Liverpool, that have come out in favour of Remain, and those where the vote is either very close or extraordinary results, as in Sheffield. So you have a very important fissure now within the English working class, particularly in those areas, and that undoubtedly is will drive a major new political dynamic within the Labour Party. So what is all this likely to mean? Just 3 issues in territorial terms I just want to touch on. Scotland. The question that will be posed, indeed it has already been posed in the media, is does this result mean that the Scots will, with the SNP, will press ahead with a demand for another referendum on their own membership of the UK? And I think this actually this situation creates a real dilemma within the SNP. And already, some of you may have heard, as I did, Alex Salmond indicating his own broad support for that idea, but he has tied that prospect to the time period of the renegotiation, which is in part, I think, an attempt to put pressure on some of his SNP colleagues. Other SNP figures will be more cautious. The debate has changed. The situation is not as it was in September, back in 2014. The economic position which Scotland finds itself in, particularly, though not entirely because of the oil price, more generally concerns about the performance of the Scottish economy, and undoubtedly worries likely to grow about the UK economy as a whole, may mean that the SNP cannot be so sure, cannot be entirely confident about what level of support independence would get. And just importantly, the support for independence has not, polls suggest, grown since September 2014. So I think Nicola Sturgeon and others in the SNP, who are pretty cautious actually as politicians, will probably want to wait to see for some while. But no doubt this is important, because I think this result confirms very powerfully the sense that England and Scotland are moving in very different directions. And I think it undoubtedly gives another argument to those who do want to push the case for independence. Secondly, England. There is clearly a large pool of very disaffected, disenchanted voters, a lot of whom are working class, and that's not entirely the demographic, but it's strong within it. And I think there is a big question here for the party system about where that pool of sentiment now goes. Is it something that's just going to be hoovered up by UKIP? And it does look as if UKIP is going to could well make serious inroads into the Labour's position, even in the first past the post system. And I think there's a very big question here now that really is something quite fundamental for our party system, not just for the individual parties. And very quickly, if I can, Matthew, just to finish, a word about Northern Ireland. There is real potential, there's a potential here that this result produces significant further instability. The peace process has already been rocking to some degree. The creation now of a hard border with the Republic of Ireland, which in many ways goes against the trends that have actually helped make the peace process stick. That's going to be a really big issue in Northern Irish politics.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. And just before I move on, can I just remind you all to tweet away and use the hashtag, if you would, of hashtag MEI Europe. That's MEI Europe. So we move to Paul.
Good morning, and thank you very much. So I can say with all certainty that Nick Clegg is not going to become an EU commissioner, as some of us previously thought. But Britain now enters a rather uncertain period. You don't need me to tell you that. But how this plays out is actually, I think, incredibly interesting. Once Article 50 of the EU treaty is triggered, that's the treaty provision relating to an exit, the UK has 2 years to negotiate its way out of the EU. If Article 50 moves beyond, or if the negotiations move beyond trade matters, any agreement will require ratification by the other 27 member states. that's something of a stumbling block in terms of any agreement. In terms of when Article 50 will be triggered, I think it's fair to say that that probably won't happen until the leadership campaign within the Conservative Party is over. So that does give the UK some time to seriously think through what kind of relationship it wants. Having said that, the articles may apply a certain amount of pressure to initiate those negotiations as soon as possible. Another stumbling block with regard to Article 50 is that it also gives the European Parliament a veto. And the UK doesn't have so many friends in the European Parliament, not least because of David Cameron's decision a while ago to remove the Conservative Party from the European People's Party. Why give special treatment to a country that, quite frankly, has been nothing but a pain? So this is where we run into difficulty. There are serious choices to be made, but they may be unpalatable to both sides. And I don't think this looks particularly well for the UK, in all honesty. On the side of the EU, it's not going to be easy to negotiate with the UK, as it may encourage other member states to leave the EU. If the UK comes out looking particularly well, has a great deal, everything is rosy, you may start a chain reaction of other member states wanting to leave. This, of course, could lead to the disintegration of the EU. However, if the UK wants access to the single market, it wants a kind of Norwegian model, it will have to accept the free movement of workers. It will have to accept the free movement of people. And such free movement will be a red line for the EU. This is one of the 4 founding principles of the treaty and is absolutely non-negotiable. So this, in many respects, is really problematic for the UK. Brexiteers or the Leave campaign simply want to close the doors. They want to pull up the bridge. But if the UK still wants to maintain its access to the single market, it will be unable to do this. It will find in these negotiations that it's not the powerful, large member state it thinks it is. It will find itself pushed in a corner. It's backed into a corner on certain issues. Access to the largest trading partner will require it to abide by the rules. It will require it to make financial contributions to the EU budget, just like Norway does, so much for all that extra cash that was promised for the NHS. And it will have to allow the free movement of workers. All of this without having any say in what happens with regard to EU policy. This doesn't seem to me to be particularly democratic or regaining control, as the slogan was for the Brexiteers. So if this particular agreement is struck, the actual relationship between the UK and the EU, in some respects, doesn't necessarily change. There are only a few dimensions in which it changes. You know, it maintains access to the single market, rather it's just not at the negotiating table. So what you can expect, I think, is another round of EU blaming, another round of bashing Brussels, and a bit more of the same. So it would be interesting to see how that pans out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope I don't do violence to the pronunciation of your very beautiful name, Sionaidh. Sionaidh. I'm so sorry. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Does this work? Yes. Okay. Well, I've been asked to talk about the legal implications of Brexit. And that sounds very technical, but actually I think there's quite a bit of politics. Law and politics often intermix. I'm going to talk about 4 issues. The first concerns what might happen while or before the Article 50 process, which we've just heard about, gets in motion. Now, there's been some talk that in the meantime, or maybe even instead of Article 50, Britain could just repeal the European Communities Act 1972. Now, this is this big piece of legislation that is the gateway for all European Union law to enter in the UK and become part of our law. And the suggestion has been that this could be repealed, and that would mean that EU law wouldn't have to apply in the UK, or at the very least, what we could do is to get rid of bits of EU law that we don't like. Now, the problem for me there is that we are still, under treaty, obliged to the EU. And so to act in this way, before we had gone through the Article 50 process, would be to act in breach of international law. That does not look very good for Britain's reputation. We've signed up to about 13,000 treaties in all, and we tend to keep to our treaty obligations. Also, our Lord Chancellor, if he remains our Lord Chancellor, Michael Gove, has sworn to uphold in his official oath the rule of law. So this might not be upholding the rule of law. There might also be a problem with the civil service carrying that out, because they have duties to comply with international law. Moving on very briefly to Article 50, whenever it is triggered. And the one point I would add to what's already been said about Article 50 is that it does have a distinct advantage from any other process or lack of process, just ignoring it, which is that it enables a majority decision to be taken by European states, rather than insisting on unanimity. That's written into the treaty, and that is helpful. Obviously, extensions have to be unanimous, but Article 50 itself, majority. So that's worth bearing in mind. Although, of course, there is this possibility that the other states might insist that this is something called a mixed agreement, which means that their own powers and competencies are at stake, and they say that each of them has to negotiate as well. But I leave that aside, that's technical. Two more points. The first concerns national law generally in the UK. Since we've been a member since 1973, so much of our law has been completely taken over in a way by EU law. Many EU directives have been implemented into Acts of Parliament. Many of those constitute individual rights, very important. How are we going to get rid of this, if indeed we are? Will it be amended, repealed, retained? This is a very important question. The assumption is that the European Communities Act will be repealed in some way, but that's not an end to it, because there are also all the other bits and pieces of EU legislation which have entered into our legal system. All of that has to be taken into account, and that is a massive, massive job, and will take up the time of many, many departments in Whitehall, and many lawyers, and lawyers are expensive, of course. There has been a suggestion that this could be done by ministerial order. That is very undemocratic, that ministers might change acts of parliament. And as we are leaving the EU supposedly to assert our democracy, that would trouble me. Finally, I move on to the question of devolution. We've already heard about this distinct difference in the way that different parts of the United Kingdom have voted. The one legal aspect that I would flag up here is the question of legislative consent. And we've already heard that Scotland might choose to wait, if indeed it does choose to hold an independence referendum. But EU law doesn't just enter the UK through the European Communities Act. It's also a condition for the legality of lawful legislation in the devolved nations, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland and Wales. They are required by legislation to comply with it. Those pieces of legislation have to be amended. Now, the Westminster Parliament could do that, but the devolved nations have to give their consent under something known as the Sewell Convention, after Lord Sewell, who's become a bit infamous now, but he piloted the devolution legislation in 1998. What if they choose not to do so? Could that prompt some sort of constitutional crisis? So before we even get on to the issue of another independence referendum, there is this issue and what Holyrood might choose to do, or what even might happen in Belfast. Finally, one thing I think is worth mentioning is the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. which impacts not just on Northern Ireland, but Ireland as well. It's an international treaty, and EU membership of the UK is written into that. It refers to the UK and Ireland, both of them as members of the EU, and various of the institutions that were set up under the Good Friday Agreement, North-South Council and so on, also make reference to the EU. This would have to be amended, because we could treat what the UK is doing now as not acting in compliance with that agreement. So there must be some sort of amendment. So that raises a further problem in the island of Ireland to what we've already heard about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sionaidh. And Brigitte.
Right. I have the difficult task to talk about the economy in 4 minutes. So I'm going to do that. I basically have 5 points I would like to develop. The first point is the huge foreign position that the UK has right now. Our current account is 7% of deficit. If you look at it, it's essentially the counterpart of the German surplus, which means one good news. The good news is that actually we are one of the engines of economic growth, if there is any, in the European Union. This figure of 7% is the worst since the Bank of England started collecting statistics in 1772. I repeat, 1772. It's also the worst current account deficit since in all the OECD countries. Now, second point, how this current account deficit is financed? Well, essentially, we depend on foreign capital. That's what we do. The UK saving ratio has decreased by 3.8%. Consumer credit has increased by 44%. Basically, we are at the same level as the pre-2007 financial crisis. Households are running deficit of 3%. Why? Essentially because they want to finance, British people would like to have a very nice lifestyle, finance lifestyle, cars. Tax structure essentially is geared toward consumption rather than investment. And the UK, if you want to be a nice metaphor, act like a giant hedge fund that is borrow short and lend long. The question with regard to my second point is, of course, what is going to be the reaction of the international market? Third point, which is rather optimistic, is that contrary to the countries in the Eurozone, Britain has a great advantage. It has its own currency. Therefore, we can use devaluation as a buffer. We can get out of trouble thanks to the devaluation. The biggest danger, of course, is how the Bank of England is going to react. If they start to overshoot with the interest rate, you can imagine what kind of situation that may create with regard to the household endowment. Fourth point, as was said before, is a trade option of Britain. Here is quite interesting. You have, of course, the Norwegian option, which means you still pay, except that you cannot vote, so there is very little advantage to be in the Norwegian option. Canadian options, well, you also have to pay a bit, except that you have limited access to the single market, or you choose WTO options, where you basically have to renegotiate all single trade agreements. Of course, here I have disregarded the Swiss and the Turkish option because they are not very attractive. Fifth, and that is my last point, is don't forget, 7% current account deficit means that for the EU, the fact that there was a Brexit is a huge consequences for the European Union. In other words, the European Union is a failure. This project has failed. What we have heard during the debate by other Europeans, instead of being very appeasing and saying to the Brits, please stay, they have threatened. They were not in position of threat. They should never have done that. It's going to be costly. Why? Because Britain is basically one of the main engines of demand in the European Union. other countries obviously are going to follow. The other countries are going to be first Netherlands, then Italy. The euro, this is because of the euro, the fact that the eurozone has put a threat on European integration by forcing the countries that were outside the eurozone to adopt some of the measures with a huge democratic deficit. In other words, all this is really not an economic debate, it's mainly a political debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Rob.
Thank you. I wish I could say something that would cheer us all up, but I'm not sure I can. I was asked to give a historical perspective, and I'm a historian of Britain and Europe, but also a historian of democracy. So I want to make 4 points under those headings. The first is that I think that the referendum has exposed but not created a crisis in our representative system. And that crisis, I think, has been building for some time, but last night it erupted. What happened last night was that the electorate repudiated the judgment, not just of the Prime Minister, but of the Leader of the Opposition, of 4/5 of the Cabinet, 3/4 of all members of Parliament, and the leaders of every major national party in the House of Commons. And it did that particularly in some of the heartland seats of Labour and the Conservative Party. So the chasm between the views of the electorate and the people that they have been voting for has been pretty brutally exposed. So as far as our democracy is concerned, I think we're simply in totally uncharted waters. There is no precedent for a parliament that is so out of kilter with the electorate, 1 year after a general election, on the most important political question of the day. And it seems to me that what happened last night was a national vote of no confidence, not just in David Cameron, but in MPs, trade unions, big business, the universities, economists, and experts of all kinds. So in that respect, I think this is a seismic moment for our whole political culture. Now, we can talk about why this happens, but I think there was a significant warning shot in last year's general election. If you have an electoral system that gives one member of parliament to 4 million UKIP voters, I think you can't be surprised if your parliament becomes dangerously disengaged from the electorate.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think the vote last night repudiates the entire course of British foreign policy since 1961. Every government for half a century has backed membership of the European community. And they've done that for the same reason, which is they've all had to face the same question. How could Britain play a leading role in the world in the wake of the British Empire, so in a post-imperial world? And the answer of every Prime Minister since Harold Macmillan has been that Britain should lead in Europe. Now, that choice has now been shut off, but the question is still there. Finding a new answer to that question is going to require some creative thinking, but it's not going to be easy. Because Britain joined the European Union in the first place, partly because it had tried and been unable to get some of the alternatives that have been put forward by Vote Leave. It had tried to get a free trade area, it had tried a Commonwealth strategy, it had tried a kind of free-floating arrangement with the United States. And all of these were perceived to have failed. Now, we live in different times, but I don't think it's going to be easier this time round. Thirdly, I think we're about to discover just how deeply the European Union has penetrated into British life. Whether we think this is a good thing or a bad, British history since 1973 would be radically different today if we had not joined the European Union. And that would be true whether we were talking about the peace process in Northern Ireland, or deindustrialization, or gay rights, or regional policy, or counter-terrorism, or nationalist politics. So I think that we're going to feel the effects of Brexit in all sorts of areas that we're not even thinking about at the moment. And I think it's going to take several years for that to become apparent. And then finally, perhaps a slightly more positive point, which is that the fact that the electorate can overturn, at a stroke, the settled policy of the entire British political leadership class, expression of democracy. And even if we don't like that decision, and I confess that I don't like that decision, that is a remarkable thing. So the challenge, I think, now is to try to close the gap between our representative democracy and our popular democracy. Because it seems to me that right now, those two are looking at each other through an entirely toxic mist of mistrust, revulsion, and betrayal. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for this absolutely fascinating and stimulating additions to a debate that's just beginning today. It's an extraordinary day, I think, to wake up into, because you have the sense of having woken up in a completely new landscape in which, of course, the high political developments are terribly important, and they are leading the news, and they will occupy the press for a long while. But actually beneath that and above it, there are issues of even greater moment that are really totally new, or if they're not totally new, they've only now become as clear and shatteringly explicit as they are. I was interested in Brigitte's observation. I mean, the whole basis of vote, the quest for votes in recent decades has been based on the idea that it's the economy stupid. But in fact, this was a political vote. It was a vote about where power lies, where control lies, and not about the sort of notion of where prosperity lies. I genuinely think this was a shift from that one model to another, and in all sorts of other ways which were expressed much more articulately than I could. I think the best way of proceeding is we've got about half an hour left, and I think we can take some questions from the floor. And the best thing really is to I think to take 3 or 4 at a time, and then just invite the panel to respond to those that interest them, and that way we can get as many people involved as possible. Yes, there's a gentleman here with spectacles. There's a roving mic, so.
Thank you. The Vote Leave side has done a brilliant job of saying that the panacea for all social, economic and political ills.
Sorry, could you speak a bit more clearly? It's very hard to...
The Vote Leave side has done a brilliant job of pointing out that the panacea for all political, social and economic ills is Brexit. That may turn out not to be the case. If that is the case, then do you think the kind of reckoning will be more severe than we've seen so far?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, at the front here.
So, given that the vast majority of the Labour Party membership and, of course, the Parliamentary Party were heavily in favour of Remain, I was at a Labour Party campaign centre yesterday at which 5 volunteers turned up throughout the entire day. Why did the Labour Party ground game campaign machine not get out of bed yesterday, and would it have made a difference?
Where are we? Yes, lady here, just in the second row, just on to my right. That's it.
Hi, I'm a journalist from Research Fortnight, so I'm asking a slightly selfish question. But Robert Saunders, you mentioned that this is a vote of no confidence in David Cameron and also in universities. What happens to our universities now?
Excellent. And one more, I think. Yes, gentleman with beard and his hand up, just here. It's here. Thank you very much.
Hello. There are around 2.99 million EU citizens working in Great Britain, and millions of English and Scottish people working in EU countries. With the outcome of the referendum, what is the consequences for all of these people?
A very good question. And one that makes me glad I'm in the chair and not answering the questions. So 4 questions, ranging from whether or not Vote Leave is a panacea. I suspect none of us really think it is, but if so, what is it? How did the Labour Party not get out of bed? What went wrong in the Labour ground war? And the very astute question just asked about the numbers of EU citizens who are here, and those Brits who are in the EU, what's going to happen to them? And of course, the latest question there. So if you'd like to start, perhaps.
Okay. On the first question, I think that's absolutely spot on. You know, if what I said is right, that the referendum has exposed a gigantic crisis of trust in our politics, then the effects of a failure to carry out the promises that have been made and voted on in this campaign and have clearly energised very large numbers of people is going to be absolutely catastrophic. And I think that is more than what happens to the pound or the economy. That is the big question of British politics in the next few years. On Labour and why Labour is so inactive, Tim and others will know more about this, but it does seem to be that in some ways Labour's enthusiasm for the European Union has actually been quite superficial over the years, and that it's often been more about being anti-Eurosceptic than about being pro-EU. And in that sense, it woke up in the last week, the more that we saw Farage and posters of a kind that Labour Party doesn't like. But I wonder whether that's part of the issue. And on the question about universities, you know, there are obviously huge implications for universities in terms of funding and EU students and so on, and we'll just have to see how that gets hammered out in the next few years. But I think there's also a question that we all have to think of as academics, which is about, you know, we are a group of people that absorb enormous amounts of public money, and that money is presumably put into universities, partly on the assumption that we can contribute something to public debate. So we have to think about, why are we failing in this respect? Actually, why are we not better at communicating with the public? Why have we become detached from what should be the audience that we're there to serve? So they're not really answers, they're just kind of more questions.
Sionaidh, would you like to kick into any of that?
Yeah, I'll just talk about the situation of EU citizens in the UK and British nationals elsewhere in the EU. And I think it's quite a worrying situation. And those are two different situations as well. The first place to look, I think, would be any withdrawal agreement under Article 50. That's going to be crucial. These people, sometimes described as having acquired or vested rights, because they've exercised their freedom of movement to go and live in another EU member state, to work there, buy property, and so on the expectation that they'd be able to continue to do so. And certainly universities are full of EU nationals from other member states. So primarily, this is something that has to be addressed in the withdrawal agreement that will be negotiated under Article 50. It's really, really important. In one of the few precedents we have of Greenland, part of Denmark, that exited the EU in the early 1980s, this was something that the European Commission was quite keen to address. But very, very few people were concerned in that case. It was very, very different, and the main issue was fish. So this is very, very different. What will happen if this issue is not addressed under Article 50? One very much hopes that it will be. But if the negotiations go wrong, if certain member states get unhappy with the line that Britain is taking, then this is a big worry, particularly if there are issues about not allowing freedom of movement in future for future movement of citizens. So we're then thrown back, if it's not agreed under the withdrawal agreement, we're thrown onto international or national law, because EU law doesn't cover this issue elsewhere. Now, international law is interesting because quite a lot of Vote Leave campaigners in the run-up to the referendum said, oh, well, this is fine. These people are protected under international law, under the Vienna Convention. I have bad news. They are not covered very much. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties refers to parties, and parties are states, not individuals. So international law offers some protection for property rights and contract rights, but I don't think for free movement. So we're then thrown onto national protection. And it's whatever that country thinks it might offer. And that might just be the same sort of rights you have as a third country national, American or South African or Australian or from wherever. And those are obviously not as generous as EU protection is. So this is a very troubling situation, and I very much hope it will be dealt with in any withdrawal agreement.
So one of the things that I find very disturbing already about this is that when one listens to a panel such as this discussing the problems that are going to arise from Brexit, that they are problems of complexity and compromise and time. And what the Brexit camp offered, above all else, was urgency and simplicity. Vote for us and all of this will go away very fast. And I think there's the scope for an angry recoil from what they are actually given is immense and rather alarming. Anyway, Mike, do chip in.
Well, just to follow up actually on exactly on that issue, just on the panacea point. I mean, clearly, now that Cameron has set a timetable for his own departure and for the election of a new Conservative Party leader, I think the sort of nature and scale of the challenge for the next Prime Minister begin to become clearer, and there is going to be a massive challenge to manage expectations. I mean, that's going to be, I think, one of the defining pressures or themes of the coming months to year. And that, whilst at the moment, of course, for the next few days, the Leave camp, all the leaders will merrily pat each other on the back. I mean, the potential, particularly for Farage, to operate as the kind of outrider, as the person who's going to really put pressure on during the course of the negotiations is considerable, and perhaps other Conservative figures as well may emerge in that role. So whoever wears the crown next is going to face a formidable array of pressures, particularly in the context of as Matthew says, a complex and rather Byzantine set of negotiations. But more substantively, I mean, what really struck me as sort of powerful and interesting about the Leave campaign was clearly one of the kind of iconic issues, or the iconic issue really it landed on, was migration. And it sort of touched on some very genuinely held fears across different communities in Britain about that. But actually it was also the skillful appropriation of Labour issues by the leading figures. I mean, quite extraordinary to see in many ways the NHS and even living standards and stagnant wages, all the kind of some of the issues Ed Miliband actually tried to talk about, suddenly being appropriated by the Leave coalition. So I think actually in substantive ways, if you look at the issues where they have made this kind of this promise, as it were, which of those issues can they actually move on? Which of them can they deliver in the circumstances they face? Probably, I mean, this goes to the negotiation points that Paul was making. I mean, perhaps migration. I mean, it just seems to me that pressure to do something in policy terms around migration probably will spill into the negotiation and what relationship what stance they take in relation to the single market. The other thing to say, I think we should remember that a lot of people voted Remain. And whilst I really think Rob's made some very powerful points, I think the problem is even more complex because you've got two communities here. You've got two very different kind of constituencies facing mainstream politicians, and the chasm between them is so significant. And many of the Remain voters are people who vote for Labour and the Conservative Party. So I think that actually makes this even harder in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say on the latter point is that I think it is very, very easy to fall into the narrative of two nations, you know, who have very little in common with each other. I think referendums, by their very nature, force people into either-or decisions. And I think we need to be careful, although I take on board everything people have said about the very profound differences sometimes between the communities who vote one way or another. I think we do need to take into account that the vast majority of people who voted one way or another do not look across a huge chasm between themselves and their neighbours. Most people in this country are fairly centrist, fairly mainstream, and voted one way or another for all sorts of very different reasons. And I wouldn't want to run too far with a narrative that is bound to grip the media, which pitches, you know, old against young, which pitches working class against middle class, which pitches, you know, all sorts of groups against each other. We need to be careful before we run away with that, I think. On the point about Labour, why didn't get out of bed? Well, we hear so much, and we've heard so much about the fabled Labour ground game. And once again, we have found that it is exactly that, a fable. Okay, I'm tired of hearing about it. If you look at membership surveys that we're doing, and we just did a survey of new Labour members back in May after the May local elections, very few of them actually get up off their butts and do anything beyond tweeting and liking stuff on Facebook. I'll just give you one statistic. 61% of all Labour members who joined since the general election have never been to a Labour Party meeting. Okay? So we are not talking, when we talk about activists, so it doesn't really surprise me, the result in those senses. And also why I don't necessarily buy into the idea that politics is now utterly presidentialised. Quite frankly, if a party chooses a leader who simply cannot inspire people who would normally vote for that party, and therefore cannot inspire them to take cues from that party, then it only has itself to blame in some ways. If Labour had elected a different leader, someone who was more capable perhaps of appealing to those so-called core Labour voters, or at least part of Labour's core Labour vote, perhaps they would have had more chance. I think Labour voters, obviously a lot of them are demographically inclined to Euroscepticism, and it would have taken a bigger and a better leader for them for Labour to have detached those people from those Eurosceptic views, and they didn't have one.
Thank you. I'm not sure there's much left for me to say, actually, but just to reiterate some of the points, I think with regard to the promises that the Leave campaign has made, they will unravel inevitably, and the consequences of that could be quite severe. There is some room for optimism, though, which is what Mike was saying. It's about managing expectations. I do think that the migration issue and the free movement of workers or free movement of people will be the central issue during the renegotiation or the negotiation of the exit. Just with regard to the Labour Party and why they didn't get out of bed, although I'm wishing I was still in bed and sleeping through this nightmare. The vote was so close. Imagine if Jeremy Corbyn hadn't have been leader of the Labour Party, and that's all you have to remember. So if you want to blame anybody, you should probably blame him. We all know that he's anti-EU. He didn't have the guts to really say it. And he came out in the referendum and said, well, I'm in, but kind of reform. It doesn't fit with a yes-no vote. It doesn't work. So he has a lot to answer for. Okay.
No, sorry, I have very little to say. I just want to share some of the question mark of some of the people I talked to while going to conferences. So basically, the American side don't understand, obviously. It's like a kind of TV reality because for them, and not only for them, but everybody else, there is only one capital in Europe. The capital of Europe is London. So it's very difficult to understand why this wonderful capital of Europe suddenly decide that they actually want to shut out every single person. The other thing is that I think I'm very lucky because I'm British as well as French, but there is about 400,000 French here. What you have here actually are the brains, the good French. Because no good French wants to be in Paris right now, for very good reason. But what we have in France, I don't want to say the bad Brits, but we have all the retirees, the ones that need health care, that need some help. So it's not really a good bargain for the French. With regard to the polls, I was in Poland, and the government of Poland is extremely happy with the Brexit because they think they could have back all the very well-trained polls. So there is some, some very good advantage. Because the mood here is quite pessimistic, I just want to cheer you up a bit and to give my French perspective. What is very impressive with Britain is the pragmatism. Yeah? It's one of the reasons why I decided more than 30 years ago to leave France, where everything in these boxes, where you need a theoretical model for absolutely everything, even going to bed, is the most rigid system you can imagine. Well, in Britain, what is wonderful is pragmatism. So I'm absolutely sure that despite all the difficulty, even if it's going to be a bit wobbly in the short term, at the end, probably London will continue to be the capital of Europe.
Philip, do you want to wind things up?
Just a couple of things. I realised, because I've seen it tweeted, and it doesn't reflect what I meant to say, but probably does reflect what I said. I mentioned when I was chatting about the difference above and below the M4 corridor, and I said that Labour's vote didn't turn out above the M4 corridor. What I actually meant by that was they turned out, they just didn't vote the way the Labour leadership wanted them to vote.
I'll say.
Actually, if you look at the class breakdown, I mean, about 2/3 of C2D voters, working class voters, voted out. I mean, it's a really sharp class distinction. And actually that causes a problem for the Labour Party, which is that there is this massive disjuncture between its electorate and the party. And actually, if anything, Corbyn is probably more in touch intellectually, on this issue at least, with these voters than many of his colleagues in the shadow cabinet or the parliamentary party are. And this is why I think, although at the moment there is this astonishing sequence of events in the Conservative Party, my suspicion is the Conservative Party actually will unite pretty quickly around a new leader. David Cameron will go, obviously George Osborne will go, and a few other people from the from the cabinet will go. But there's plenty of people who are, they may have come out formally for Remain, but they're not that. They're not crying this morning with horror at the thought that we're going to leave the European Union. The parliamentary party is overwhelmingly Eurosceptic. The party in the country is overwhelmingly Eurosceptic. I think they will unite fairly quickly. They may then face all of these problems of delivery that we're talking about, but actually, in the short term, I think this is going to be relatively painless for the Conservative Party. That is not going to be true for the Labour Party. I think this is going to be a sort of existential moment for the party. On the issue of Labour's ground war, Tim picked up on bodies. All I would say is wait until the spending figures are released. I think you will find that the Labour Party, if not the Labour leadership, but the Labour Party as an organisation put an awful lot of money into from what I've heard, an awful lot of money into direct mail and social media advertising. It's one of the untold stories of this campaign, and they were desperate. They were ramping up the spending in the last few days, desperately hoping that this would deliver victory, and it didn't. And one final point, which is not really an answer to any question, but it's an observation I have. When David Cameron made his famous speech about wanting the party to stop banging on about Europe, he explicitly said, as his example of the sort of person he had in mind who was put off by this, people who were struggling taking their kids to school. He mentioned the school run explicitly. They were trying to get on with their life, taking their kids to school, and all they heard was the Conservative Party banging on about Europe, and they should stop that. When he announced his speech in Bloomberg that he was going to hold this referendum during the last Parliament, he announced it precisely at the time that people would be taking their kids to school. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the school run. Even then I thought, this is curious. He has now announced his resignation. Well, people are taking their kids to school. There is an astonishing sort of holy trinity about this, almost. This was not supposed to end like this.
What a good way to end a rather extraordinary gathering. And I'm sorry I have to draw things to a conclusion, but I do, and I know you all have other things to go to. Can I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, who I think said extraordinary things. Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Disagree with Tim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.